Hello, I'm Liam Shaw, and I'm a biologist at the University of Bristol, and I work on plasmid evolution and antibiotic resistance, but I'm not going to be talking about my actual research today. I'm going to be talking about a book that I've written, a popular science book that's a chronological history of antibiotics and AMR from billions of years ago to the present. And it's called Dangerous Miracle, and you can buy it now. Probably an ideal Christmas present for the microbiologist or person interested in AMR in your life, or even for somebody who doesn't know anything about the topic as well. I really wrote it for a wide audience. And I tell the story of antibiotics over the really, from billions of years ago, because of course they're made by bacteria and fungi originally to the present day. But I do that through 10 different antibiotics, one per chapter. There's a huge amount in the book, as you'll find out if you read it, but I just want to talk about one story today, which I think is particularly interesting and I think tells us a lot about where we are at the moment in terms of developing new antibiotics. So I'm going to talk about plasmamycin. Some of you may have heard of it, but I'll explain what it is. So I want to go back first to the 1950s. We often hear about the golden age of antibiotic discovery. So in this golden age, we had an increasing availability of antibiotics. And this is showing the number of deaths at one hospital in Boston from organisms like E. coli and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So what happened as antibiotics became more available? Actually, the number of deaths increased. So antibiotics did more than just change and massively improve health. They made new types of organisms a major threat. So we often talk about the escape pathogens now, including E. coli and Pseudomonas. Those organisms only infrequently caused fatal infections before antibacterial drugs, which I think is something that people often aren't aware of. So there was already, as well as resistance, there was an appreciation that antibiotics somehow changed the type of bacteria that caused infections. So in the 1950s, people were already saying, we may run clean out of effective ammunition, then how the bacteria and molds will lord it. There was this understanding that you needed to keep developing new antibiotics because you selected for resistance and the old ones stopped working. So it's not a new problem. And if we look back over people who've written books about this, in 1972, Isaac Asimov, the great science fiction writer, in his Guide to Science, he talks about antibiotic resistance and he strikes a pretty optimistic tone. He says, yes, the bacteria evolve resistance, but the chemists can make new antibiotics which will get around the resistance. And he says, presumably, the merry-go-round will go on forever. So that's a pretty optimistic view of antibiotic discovery. By 1982, you have this book called Germs That Won't Die, forecasting the end of antibiotics. In 1992, you have this book, The Antibiotic Paradox, talking about how miracle drugs are destroying the miracle. And there's other books I could have chosen as well. So this isn't a new problem. People have been kind of talking about it for a long time. In the late 1990s, people had this idea that genomics was going to save us. And the idea was that as the first bacterial genomes came available, so in 1995, we have the first one, that you'd be able to identify essential genes in bacteria. You'd experimentally test and identify with sequencing the genes that bacteria had to have. Then you'd screen chemical libraries against those targets for binding, and then you'd profit because you'd find new antibiotics from your chemical libraries. Unfortunately, this didn't work very well. So GSK were heavily involved in this. They invested lots of money in this strategy to find new antibiotics. And there's a paper from 2007 that reports their experience. So they started with 300 essential gene targets. They ran these high throughput screening campaigns. Each one of them had over 250,000 chemical compounds. They found 16 hits. They took 5 of them forward for further development, and none of them became an antibiotic, like a total failure of this screening method. And other companies had similar experiences as well. So at around this time, you see lots of big pharmaceutical companies leaving the area of antibiotics because it's hard to develop new ones. So there's a future crisis of rising antibiotic resistance. Some people saw a business opportunity here. So carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, they were kind of observed in the early 2000s as a small problem, but you can forecast that that small problem is going to rise in importance. So people were thinking, we're in 2004, there's a possible future where CRE becomes a major issue and we're going to need new antibiotics to treat them. But it takes 10 to 15 years to develop a new antibiotic and get it into patients. So you need to start now. So in fact, other companies abandoning antibiotics is kind of a business opportunity, because if you start developing the antibiotics now against CRE, you'll be in a good position when they're really needed. And I'm going to talk about a company called Achaogen, which was founded in 2004 in South San Francisco, this hotbed of biotechnology activity. So I'm showing here, this is Genentech, the sort of grandfather of biotechnology. They use recombinant DNA to make human insulin. And you can see that, you might not be able to see, but this is their campus, and that's DNA Way, this road that winds through their South Francisco campus. So Achaogen had buildings here. They were very much at the heart of South San Francisco biotechnology. And the concept of Achaogen was to develop new methods of attacking drug-resistant bacteria. One of them, which was the initial one, which was really cool, was that they would get new compounds that would stop the ability of bacteria to evolve. So when bacteria are exposed to antibiotics, they have a stress response and the mutation rate increases 100-fold. So the idea was, if you could stop the mutation rate increasing, you would stop them being able to evolve resistance. This was a very cool idea and it did not work. So they were not able to take that forward. But on the side, they'd been investigating sort of other options to safeguard their investors' capital. So there's this saying from the Nobel laureate James Black, who is a chemist who developed very important drugs. He said the most fruitful basis for discovering a new drug is to start with an old drug. So that's what Achaogen did in parallel to this kind of more exciting strategy. They took an old drug, cisamycin, which was an aminoglycoside found from a soil bacterium in Inyo National Forest in America. And then they tweaked that using clever aminoglycoside chemistry to come up with plasmamycin. So they first synthesized that in 2008. And this was a next generation aminoglycoside that solved the problem of aminoglycoside resistance and was also effective against CRE. The question was how to fund its development. So it's all very well to say in 10 to 15 years, we'll be able to make lots of money. You need capital, in the here and now to develop the drug. And here, there's a surprising aspect to the story. So going back a few years earlier, there was bioterrorism in America. So in the aftermath of the September the 11th attacks, some people who are old enough might remember that letters were sent to politicians and news organizations in the US. And these letters seemed as if they'd been written by children, but then when you open them, a white powder came out and they had notes inside them that said things like 9/11, this is next, take penicillin now, penicillin misspelt, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. So this was the anthrax letter attacks. The powder was spores of Bacillus anthracis or anthrax, and if you inhale those spores, they can be fatal. So there was panic, like America was really on a knife edge. This was in October after the September the 11th attacks, and there were massive effects. They had to close the Senate. They had to close offices all over America. People got terrified of opening their mail. And everyone who had been exposed to this anthrax was treated with ciprofloxacin. Unfortunately, the strain of anthrax that the terrorists had used was susceptible. So I'm not going to talk about the terrorists. There's a really interesting kind of story there. No one was ever actually prosecuted for it. And the main suspect died in 2008, but with the FBI planning to charge them. I won't talk more about that, but you can ask me about it if you're interested. And in fact, the ciprofloxacin label from the FDA still mentions the attacks. So there's this indication for use against inhalational anthrax. Of course, they didn't have a clinical trial, but they said, well, we gave it to more than 9,000 people for 60 days after they were potentially exposed to anthrax in 2001, and none of them got inhalational anthrax. So hopefully it works. But the attacks still led to 5 people dead, at least 17 people were made very sick. There were shortages of antibiotics and gas masks. So Vice President Dick Cheney, he took to carrying a hazmat suit in the back of his car everywhere he went. Um, hundreds of millions of dollars in decontamination costs, billions of dollars of economic damage as well, and then hoax copycat attacks where people started sending, talcum powder in the post. So this was very, very bad, but it could have been so much worse, because what if the anthrax had been a resistant strain? So in this context, the Bush administration came up with Project BioShield, which was explicitly part of the war on terror. So that allocated $5.6 billion to be spent on medical countermeasures to protect American citizens against bioterrorism, because they were thinking, okay, these anthrax letters just seem to be a kind of lone wolf attack, but what about outlaw regimes? And this was the term they used, such as Iraq. This was at the time of the Iraq War when America invaded Iraq. And Colin Powell told the UN Security Council, and this is a literal quote, that Saddam Hussein, could have thousands of teaspoonfuls of anthrax. And just one teaspoonful had shut down the US Senate. What would thousands of teaspoonfuls do? But they had no real fixed idea of what this money should actually be spent on. They just allocated, as part of the war on terror, billions of dollars of public money to be spent on protection, but they didn't really know what that meant. So this was a surprising boon for antibiotic development, and Achaogen, as a company, were amazingly effective at getting the military to give them money to develop antibiotics, because they argued that the antibiotics they were developing for CRE could also be used to defend against other bacterial threats that could be part of bioterrorism. And in total, in 4 years, they got about $150 million of government funding. This is a really interesting article by John Holway, who I spoke to as part of the research for my book, and I spoke to other people who'd worked at Achaogen, but he was their business development manager. And in the article, he talks about going beyond venture capital. So you get this sort of funding that you never have to give the money back. The government doesn't get anything, they don't get shares in the company, so you don't dilute your own shares, but it allows you to grow the company, and they're getting, security in the event of bioterrorism as a result. So the progress of plasmamycin was by antibiotic terms, pretty rapid. It was made in 2008. In 2009, it went into phase 1 safety trials. By 2014, it was in phase 3 trials for bloodstream infections and for complicated urinary tract infections. And in 2014, Achaogen went public. So they had their initial public offering of shares, and they raised $80 million. And they needed this money to go from being a startup to being a pharmaceutical company. So one option would be that as a startup, you just get bought by a big pharmaceutical company, and the big pharmaceutical company has all the money that is needed for funding clinical trials, for getting the supply chains ready for manufacturing the antibiotic, for their sales and marketing force to advertise the antibiotic, and for possible future trials that get mandated by the FDA if your antibiotic gets approved, that you have to do, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But Achaogen decided, and were very explicit, that they were going to go it alone. They were going to become a pharmaceutical company, from being a startup. This was incredibly ambitious. But their phase 3 trial results were really good. So here I'm showing the results from serious CRE infections. And you can see that plasmamycin is doing much, much better than colistin for survival. Unfortunately, the number of patients is really, really small. Now, this is pretty obvious when you think about it. It's very hard to do a trial in intensive care units of these, critically ill people, giving them different antibiotics. It's just very, very difficult. There were 69 patients in the trial in total. They spent 12 days on average in this trial. It took 2 to 3 years, and it cost $1 million. And they actually ended the trial early because they realized they were not going to recruit the hundreds of patients that they'd envisaged. It was a total disaster. Fortunately, they'd got this other phase 3 trial in complicated urinary tract infections, which was easier to do, and they were able to recruit many more numbers because they're just easier. It's an easier trial to run. So what was happening to the stock price at the time? At the end of 2016, the phase 3 results were published. and they looked really good. So, you know, as I've shown you, the number of patients was small, but people hadn't really clocked that that might be a problem. And the market responded really positively and shares soared. And actually, John Holway, who I mentioned earlier, the business development manager, he was just about to get on a plane to Las Vegas when the results dropped and when they were published in a press release. And his brother-in-law phoned him and said, "Oh, you should see these results. They're out now. You know, it looks really promising." He'd actually left Achaogen, but he still had shares in the company. And when he arrived in Las Vegas, his shares had, like, you know, doubled in value. So he thought, "Oh, I can get my wife a present, like Christmas is coming up." So he, you know, in Las Vegas, bought her an expensive Prada purse. And it was so unusual and so out of his normal habit of spending that his credit card company flagged it as a fraud attempt and phoned his wife. And then she phoned me and said, "Either you're having an affair or I just got something really nice for Christmas." So the money was really booming. Everyone was feeling good about Achaogen. The total value of the company pretty soon was over $1 billion. Then what happened? Absolute disaster. So what happened along the way here? Well, here's one particular event. Plasmamycin was recommended for FDA approval. So on that recommendation, the shares took a huge drop. What on earth went wrong? Well, you can read the minutes of the Antimicrobial Drugs Advisory Committee for plasmamycin. And it's really fascinating because you can see the discussion that the panel of independent academics and experts were having as to their recommendation for the FDA. And they approved plasmamycin for complicated urinary tract infections, but not for bloodstream infections. And members of the panel actually said in practice, they expected that doctors would be using it for this because it looked better than colistin, you know, the currently best available treatment, which is actually pretty rubbish. But the trial evidence wasn't substantial. They felt that the statistical evidence just wasn't there. And they accepted that the trial had been very difficult to run. And even plasmamycin was being considered under a new pathway for approval that President Obama had this Cures Act, which was meant to make it easier for antibiotics like this to get to market. But it was the first to be considered under that pathway, and they didn't approve it. So the problem, the reason the shares continued to slump is that the market realized that plasmamycin was not going to make any money. It was simultaneously too cheap and too expensive. What do I mean by that? Well, Medicare would only reimburse $3,000 per patient. Now, that was half of the cost of it, of plasmamycin, but that compares to $180,000 for some cancer treatments. So this is really, really low. You know, the price point is low, considering it's a life-saving medicine. But it was also too expensive. So in comparison to colistin, which, you know, is a generic drug, costs $56 a day, which doctor or healthcare system is going to use plasmamycin as a first port of call rather than colistin? And the patient population is also tiny. You know, the reason it was hard to do the trial is that there's very few numbers of patients with serious bloodstream infections of CRE. But that means that the patient population to use the drug is also very small. And the total from sales that plasmamycin made while Achaogen was still going was just about $1 million, which is a really small number. And they went bankrupt. They filed for bankruptcy in April 2019, and they were sold for $16 million. Now, this was less than the value of the first grant that they got from the US government. So hundreds of millions of dollars of funding, both from public sources, from foundations, including the Wellcome Trust, and investment from venture capitalists, and it all just imploded. And this $60 million included the global rights for plasmamycin. It was bought by another company that now markets it in the US. So this bankruptcy in 2019 was widely discussed at the time because it highlighted that antibiotics was, you know, a really disastrous area. And there were other startups as well that successfully got their drug approved, but then went bankrupt shortly after that year and in the following years. So the problem was that the market hadn't actually grown as Achaogen hoped, which was a really good thing. Cases of CRE had not become a major issue that was swamping US healthcare. They were actually very early on, you know, and the number of cases was very low. But this meant that you couldn't make money from the antibiotic. So there's an analysis of the financial failure of Achaogen, which is really excellent. I would recommend it. And those authors called it the wrong drug in the wrong place at the wrong time. So scientifically, it was a huge success. They managed to do some very complicated aminoglycoside chemistry and modify an existing aminoglycoside and make a new antibiotic that worked against resistant bacteria. Perfect. But unfortunately, the economic forces at play in the market led to it being a disaster. So what's changed since then? Well, we have things like CARB-X. That's an organization. Their aim is to stop startups going bankrupt. So they try and bridge this difficult phase where startups have basic research but need to expand their operations and often just have cash flow problems and can't afford to pay their staff. So they award money to promising antibiotic research, and you can see the funders there. It includes BARDA. This is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority from the US government, which was a direct result of Project BioShield, initially set up from Project BioShield. We also have things like GuardP. The aim of GuardP, which is a non-profit organization, is to help new antibiotics to serve public health. That's my summary of their aim. And they attempt to de-risk antibiotic development through public-private partnerships. So GuardP provides scientific expertise and kind of assistance to companies in return for the rights to market those antibiotics and license them to manufacturers in parts of the world where the company wouldn't even want to be doing that anyway. And these are both, I would say, very notable and laudable things. But what about large pharmaceutical companies themselves? Well, in 2019, Jim O'Neill, who wrote the famous O'Neill Review of 2016, said that there's endless talk, but no progress. And he said that sometimes he felt like it was time to just take it away from them and take it over, meaning that they couldn't be left to, they couldn't be incentivized to do antibiotics. It should actually be taken over by the government, which was an idea that he admitted in that interview that he would have once found a bit crazy. But he's an ex-Goldman Sachs banker, an ex-Conservative minister, saying that he's unimpressed with the progress. Now, in 2020 onwards, you have the AMR Action Fund, and this is 20 pharmaceutical companies pooling their funds for development of supposedly 2 to 4 new antibiotics by 2030. That's their aim. So if you work this out, this is an average investment of about $50 million per company, and the cost for developing a drug, pharmaceutical industry's own figures, which you might be skeptical about, is over $2 billion. So this is, I would say, is a way for pharmaceutical companies to get some good PR and work collectively when actually they themselves have abandoned antibiotic development, many of them. That's not to say that this isn't a positive thing. It's just to put it in context of why they might be doing that. And the pharmaceutical industry has changed a lot. This is something you see if you look at its history. So here's a figure of different pharmaceutical companies starting in 1989 and going forward to 2002, so 20 years ago. And you can see that more than 27 companies in 1989, through successive mergers, have become just 8 bigger companies in 2002. And this is from the Antitrust Division of the US Department of Justice. So mergers have become a really huge part of the pharmaceutical industry over recent decades. And several of the largest companies in the world completed as many of those in 2 years as they did in the decade before. We know that patents per year fall by about 20% after a merger. And John LaMattina, who's the ex-Pfizer head of R&D, at one point, he has called mergers bad for science, bad for patients, bad for medicine. So what? I'm going to wrap up now. What do we learn from plasmamycin? Well, developing antibiotics is difficult, but it is possible. But unfortunately, new antibiotics are almost perfect anti-capitalist commodities. If you wanted to design something that sort of interacted worse with the current drug development environment, you would struggle. So over 100 years, the need for new antibiotics hasn't changed, but the pharma industry has. So lots of things about the way that the pharmaceutical industry operates now, this reliance on patents, for example, that didn't used to be the case. For example, in America until 1952, it was questionable whether you could even patent a natural product, but prompted in part by antibiotics and by lobbying from the pharmaceutical industry at the time, you could then patent a natural product. So lots of changes have happened in the pharmaceutical industry. Many of the antibiotics that we have now, you can point to examples like penicillin or isoniazid. there was no central patent on the substance itself when they were developed. So it was possible once to do antibiotic development differently. But development now is almost entirely reliant on spin-outs and startups. So the large pharmaceutical companies, what some people call big pharma, they don't do that innovation themselves. They seek to acquire it. And if it's not financially profitable for them to acquire a startup developing an antibiotic, they won't do it. There are lots of suggestions for how to change that. Some are more radical than others. And if you want to know more, you can read the book where I discuss them. But I'd end with a kind of provocation to myself as much as to other people on this call. What's the point of all this fantastic basic research to better understand AMR if we can't fix problems that we already understand quite well? I'll finish there, and if you'd like to know more, you can buy the book, but I'd be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.